if somebody were listening, that's the story I'd want them to hear. That all and everything is enough. There's no need to take away or to add in more than is present. But to be present to the reality of that there is everything that's there, and then to make choices about what you choose in any given moment to align with and move forward is what it is to become fully human.
My third eye is so bright. I've got to wear shades. Do you have a pair of these?
I do not have a pair of those. That should be like, you should be sending those to anyone that you do these interviews with, so that we can also, diminish the intensity of that third eye input.
Dr. Joseph Riggio, let me share your bio. You are a cognitive scientist with deep expertise in transformational communication, decision-making, and non-ordinary cognition. You are an architect and designer of the MythoSelf Process and Soma-Semantics. You are an international figure in the professional NLP and hypnosis communities. You're a well-known speaker and writer on the topics of transformational change, leadership, and elite performance. You have authored the books, The State of Perfection, Experiencing the Hero's Journey, Be Your Beast, Oh Best.
Your best, definitely.
Your Best Beast? Towards a theory of transpersonal decision-making in human systems. You are renowned for your capacity of insight into what motivates people to act personally and professionally, and you organize the means to articulate specific messages that move individuals to take action. You work as a transformational change artist for leaders, entire organizations, and circles. Topological circles. You help your clients move forward with integrity, elegance, and aplomb. Joseph Riggio, let me give you your existential bio.
I love it. It's like a astrology reading. Like we're doing tarot cards and stuff. I'm so excited.
Me too.
You'll get the actual response, because I haven't heard this. So this is the live emotional cognitive input. You're gonna get it all.
You're gonna watch your micro expressions as they unfold.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Dr. Joseph Riggio, you are an architect of the mind. Your cognitions are non-ordinary. You are an epistemologist, but only ontologically. You're a change artist with a bias towards singing, dancing, and eating. You time slide into home plate. You would prefer to be in Sicily. You give a mean cerebellum. You're a cybernetic control freak communicator. You love pasta, women and children, shapes and numbers. You abide.
I like that one better than the official one. That's way better. I'm going to transcribe that, put it on my website now,
Please do.
I'll give you credit, I promise. I'll give the existentialist ontologist lots of credit.
All I need is existential credit. Dr. Joseph Riggio, I am so grateful that you're joining me in this ridiculous moment now. You are granting me an audience and gracing me with your extraordinary life's presence. 60 years an olive tree plus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was hoping you could share your hero's journey with us today. Really, your life story, because you happen to be an expert in the hero's journey, which makes the whole conversation more meta than usual. Mm-hmm. And so I was hoping you could start by sharing how you were basically put onto the cosmic conveyor belt like every other person, who you were meant to grow up, learn a craft, go to work, get married, have children, retire, and wait to die.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, starting at age 17, existential angst began to creep in. And we are very interested in existential angst and how that blossomed by age 27 into a full-blown existential crisis. What can you tell me about that?
Well, I think the first thing is we should step back and go a little bit before the existential angst. Let's not dive people directly into existential angst if we don't have to, right?
Aww.
So the thing is, I had kind of an idyllic childhood. I was, my father's family had bought a farm in central New Jersey, and my father was working for the housing authority of the city of Newark. So I was growing up and lived in a home in the city of Newark. And I spent most of my weekends for the first at least 5 years of my life at my grandparents' farm. So 3 days a week I was down there. And the other, 4 days a week, I was back up in Newark in the city. And this continued not so much, when I was in school, I didn't spend as much time at my grandparents, but we were there probably 1 day a week every week. And I spent summers there often. And so I had this kind of city farm, city rural lifestyle that I was growing up in. And I got to see both sides of it. And I would say now, looking back, I don't think I'd use this word back then, but looking back, that part of my childhood was really magical. And you made this comment in my existential autobiography that I would prefer to be in Sicily. And that comment, I'm sure, comes out of a deep research project you've ran on my history and background and my sense of a love of Sicily and the love that came from Sicily, which was really my grandparents' love. So what happened was my grandfather, who was in his mid-60s himself when I was born, was the Sicilian man of record, so to speak. And I looked to him in many ways as a young kid. He brought a lot into my life. And I think set me up in some ways for the entirety of all of that journey that we're now going to dive into. So it was a great love affair between me and my grandfather. And I had love in my life from lots of people, my grandmothers on both sides. I never met my mom's grandfather, my mom's father, my grandfather on that side. And my dad was a very loving guy as well. And I had aunts and uncles and cousins and this big Italian American family who would get together every weekend. So there was lots and lots and lots of that. And somehow in the midst of all that, a message came through. And the message was, be yourself. I don't know how. I really can't explain it because not all my cousins got it, for sure. A couple of them did. And my brother, who was a completely different character as a young guy than I was, did not get it, although he has a lot of it now. So it kind of filtered in, obviously, because it's shown up in his later years. He's a couple of years younger than me, but he's been more and more and more pursuing that kind of an ideal as well. But I pretty much rejected the entire imposition that I was supposed to be good and fit in. In fact, I thought that was a message to rebel, what not to be doing. And so I very seldom fit in. I very seldom was particularly good. And my parents had a lot of angst around me. I never did anything terrible. I never burned down buildings or, committed an international crime of treason or anything. And I wasn't into drugs. I was into women. But, it was normal kind of teenage stuff up until the point where it became obvious that the intention for me was to graduate high school, go to college, as I say. And college wasn't like something that you did to get an education. It was something you did to build a career. So you went to school, specifically where I came from, very blue collar working family area. You went to, university because that was vocational school. And it was going to get you the ticket to get a good job, to make enough money, to buy a house, to get married, to have kids, to retire. And then eventually, as I say in that manuscript, die. And this was not making sense to me even back then. So I kind of thought about, what I wanted to do and what interested me. And at the time, the only thing that was really particularly interesting was architecture. And that was because my dad was, in fact, a contractor at that time. And I had done a lot of projects with him and worked with him, was out in the field and knew a little bit about the construction industry. And I love the aesthetics of architecture, and I still do, even though I'm not practicing anymore. And what I loved about the education that I began to enter into after high school in architecture school was it built what I'm going to call a design mind into me. I think in design terms, I think aesthetically. And that created tremendous conflict with the idea of the practicality that I was being introduced to, which was defined in some ways as the practicality of, again, getting a job, making a living, show up every day, do the 9-to-5 thing, put money away, retire. It didn't make sense to me. There was no beauty in that life. It was the life of the servitude. It was the life of the peasant, and the person who was going to labor and slave for their life to produce for others. And I still think that's true to a very great extent after having spent 40 years out of that domain, out of that particular experience. And so I did a bit of school, architecture, and I accumulated way more credits than I needed to graduate, but chose never to graduate for a number of reasons. The number of reasons is very simple. I had to jump through hoops to do the elective particulars that they wanted me to do, and I refused. So I instead decided I would apply to a master's program without an undergraduate. And they went, no way, can't do it, not allowed, not part of the rule set. And that was really probably the kickoff of the existential angst. Like, I want to be someone, I want to do something. And the thing that I want to do is not going to be easy for me to get to. And that time I probably thought not possible for me to get to if I don't concede, if I don't comply and follow the rule set that's being laid out for me, which was not going to happen. And I knew it was going to happen. So I probably had more jobs than any, group of the interviewees that you're going to put together over the next 2 years by myself. I did everything. I mean, I went from job to job to job, whether it was working in supermarkets or restaurants or bars, doing construction work, anything you can think of. I mean, it was just crazy, all the different things I jumped into to try to play around and find what I could do that would be interesting and good without giving up this idea of pursuing what I wanted to do. And what I wanted to do at that time was to get into this master's program in cognitive science. And because I realized that my interest wasn't in things as much as the mind. And I didn't understand at that time the connection that I was making between that architectural design education and the way that the mind is a design function, the way that it organizes the world in what I think of as design terms. Right? And eventually I convinced the school to let me into classes. And I went, if I fail the class, the first set of classes you let me into, then just kick me out. What do you got to lose, right? And they went, we can't do that. We can let you into the classes to audit them. If you audit the classes and do well in them, then we can let you into the program. So they and I went, that was cool. That was an acceptable compromise. And so I audited the classes I want, and they went, okay, you did really, really well, and we're happy to give you an invitation to come into the program. We'll give you credit for the classes you audited, and you can begin next semester. I went, well, I actually took all the classes I wanted to take. I don't need the invitation. Thank you very much. And I walked away. Never did the master's program. But I had gotten the education I wanted, and I met the professors, and I actually remained friendly with a number of them for years and years. And at that time, I came across this thing called NLP. And by this time, I'm in full-blown existential angst. And the existential angst is this question, not what, but who do I want to be when I grow up? And I ran into this character who understood that question. He was the first person I ever came across who truly understood the question, because he thought in ontological terms. And everybody I'd met up until then thought either pragmatically or epistemologically. They thought about what you think about ideas, information, understanding was really important, especially in school, right? You have to understand things. And by that time, I had been a kind of a seminar junkie in formation. So I was attending a lot of different seminars. And most of them were about this idea of understanding. And the guy that I loved the most at that time was this character, Werner Erhard. And Werner was my kind of guy. Werner wakes up one day as Jack Rosenblum, I think his name was, and decides that he can no longer tolerate and abide by living in Pennsylvania as a car salesman, raising 2 children with the wife that he's married to. So he goes out for cigarettes, gets on a plane, on the way to California, changes his name to Werner Erhard, and lands and decides he's going to sell Encyclopedia Britannicas and never comes back. Now, that's not the part I like. I think that's kind of almost duplicitous in terms of, abandoning your family. But he just couldn't abide, couldn't do it, couldn't make sense of it at that time. He knew that he had led up to that life. He had been brought into that moment of his life by all these forces that were the forces of be good and fit in, and had an awakening that this was not going to ever satisfy who he knew himself to be. So he begins taking some seminars too. He takes some courses, and he realizes that there's this kind of way that he can be in the world, which creates the successes he's realizing, because he's super successful as an Encyclopedia Britannica salesperson. He's doing really, really well. He's managing a group of people at this point, and he puts together for a couple of friends, after a number of different experiences he had, this thing he calls est, taking the Latin word, it is, and also, or to be, depending on how you want to interpret it, and then also the idea that it's Earhart Seminar Training, EST, right? It's a very clever little double entendre there, which tells you a little bit of how Warner's mind works. Really brilliant guy.
He was an early pioneer of the acronym.
Yeah. Exactly. I think IBM preceded him, but he was definitely, not quite an acronym, but the three-initial idea or three-letter idea. And the seminars he's doing, he's literally doing in his living room in California. Now, California at this moment in time, we're talking like probably late 1970s, if I recall correctly, is a hotbed of new ideas, existential angst, right? And people are trying to find out, who am I supposed to be when I grow up? That's the question everybody's asking. I got to find myself. Half the population of the United States who's between the age of 18 and 80 is trying to get themselves to India to find a guru to study under and to chant their way to happiness. The other, remaining population is trying to find a guru here in the United States that they can at least attend a seminar with, and one of them happens to be Werner Erhard. So he's doing these things in his living room. And Werner, I'll tell you my introduction to Werner. I did the last training before the forum became official, the revised training. And it wasn't with Werner, it was a couple of his trainers. And they came in the room, and the first thing I remember, and I can't swear it was exactly like this, but there's this big setup, this big build-up, sit in the chairs, here's the rules, sit down, be good, blah, 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 here's how we're going to do it. And then the trainer comes in. And the trainer is presented almost like as this mystical character who's been through the needle of transformation. And at this moment, he goes, do you know why I'm here? Do you know why I'm here in front of the room and you're there? Because your life doesn't work and my life does. And do you know why? Because you're tubes. You've put in food in one end and it comes out the other. And that's what your life's composed of. You're all just assholes. That was the beginning of the training. So, it went downhill from there, by the way. So this is the kind of training that Werner put together. It was really in-your-face, aggressive confrontation. And it was built around getting people to the recognition that they were really full of shit. And it was both literal and metaphorical, right? And the idea that they had been fed not just food, that they had taken in and digested and excreted without really paying attention to the process of what was going on. Or in most cases, fast food phenomena in the United States, not paying attention to the quality either that was happening even at the front end of the process. But they were doing the same thing with learning the information that was being fed to them. Mm-hmm. So there was this huge, tube, force-feeding tube called television. And while Werner never said that, never pointed it out, none of the trainers talked about it, it became obvious to me that this had to be part of the understanding they had, is that society feeds us the current mythology that serves society, not the one that serves the individual. And the design is to make it so easy to engulf that message and to assimilate it and treat it as though it's your own, that it becomes almost impossible for the average person to ever, take their mouth off of the feeding tube. Mm-hmm. Recognize that there's other food. While it may be more challenging to get, to prepare, to chew, and to digest, is way more nourishing. Mm-hmm.
Can I say
this is
that,
really
sorry to interrupt. I get the picture of that scene in The Matrix when they unplug Neo from the pod that he's in, where he is literally plugged into receiving certain food and excreting other, and this makes me think of that very thing.
Right. And not only, I mean, there's that shoots out of it, but if you remember, all of the other tubes that are on his spinal cord and into the back of his head pop off as well.
Yes.
So they're also feeding him lots of data. But for him, and it's really interesting that you use that Wachowski, imagery. And the idea is that he's not in the matrix. From his point of view, he's in reality. And this is where most of society is most of the time, from time immemorial.
And let me just clarify that. So when he is in the matrix, actually, he believes he's in reality. But
of course,
we come to learn that is a fabricated reality, and his true reality is something else altogether.
Yeah. There's a number of scholars, let's call them, especially some of the French characters. The French are always examining the possibility of absurdity and non-realities, right? And they postulate this idea, this could all be a simulation, literally. You and I could be part of a simulation that we think is as real as Neo thought the Matrix was real. And, the idea of the simulation is, in fact, a fact to truth, as I would call it, in the sense that fabricated reality you described, the one that's fed into us all night and day in different ways from the time we leave the womb, for us is reality. Right? I point this out when I'm working with people in groups, the kinds of things that they do without any thought process whatsoever and treat as though it's real. Right? I'll give you a simple example. We think what we're doing is real in the sense that this is what language and communication is. But this is just nonsense and absurdity if you go to somebody who was born and raised speaking Mandarin and doesn't understand any of this. Mm-hmm. But for us, we can't get out of the stream of this. And Mandarin is nonsense and absurdity to us.
So I did interrupt your sequencing, your timeline. Could you take me back to where you learned that you were a tube?
Sure. So I'm now kind of dealing with this idea that Werner opens my eyes up to. We're in the late 1980s, and I am really struggling to make sense of the world. Like, what does it really mean to be an adult? What does it really mean to be a human being? How am I supposed to relate to other people? I lived through the 70s and the flourish of the hippie years as a, adolescent. Prior to that, as a pre-adolescent toddler, was the 1960s for me. And the world was changing. We were in a period of massive cultural transformation. And everybody around me, my parents, were part of a different world. They were not part of this transformational generation. My older cousins were immersed in the transformational generation. A famous story in the family is one of my cousins calls his mom. Now you have to remember, we're traditional Italian-American family. You literally, as an example of what that means, is don't leave the house that you're born in with your parents and your siblings until you're married. So if you're 52 or 24 or 36, doesn't matter. When you get married, that's when you leave home. Otherwise, you're home with mom and dad and they take care of you. Wednesday night's pasta night kind of a thing. Sunday, get together with the family and have a big meal. So my cousin calls up. He goes, Mom, I'm going to go to Washington, D.C. to pick apples. And she freaks. We're over the house. We're having cake and coffee, because that's another thing you do. You sit around and have cake and coffee. I'm a little kid. I'm probably 9 years old, 10 years old at the time. And this cousin calls and goes, I'm going to California, to Washington State, and I'm going to pick apples. I'm going to be a migrant worker. And she's out of her mind. And we hear only her end on the phone. And she's using a few epitaphs with him. And, blah, 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 get home. Blah, 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 blah. No, you're not. And finally, she hangs up the phone and she's furious. She's got tears of fury, not sadness, but rage in her eyes. And my mother, who's her younger sister, says, what, Faye, what's the matter? He goes, my son's going to Washington to pick apples. And I told him to come home. And the SOB said, I can't. I'm in Kansas City. So he was halfway there, So these were the cousins that I had. They were going to go find themselves by doing stuff like pick apples in Washington as a migrant worker to see if that was like their calling, right? And so there was this kind of world that I grew up in, which was really fractured in some way. I tell this story often that another thing that was happening is we were invaded, if you want to call it that, here in the United States in this, very nice, waspy, white Anglo-Saxon, Protestant American ethos with the Orient. It showed up in our yards. The soldiers that were part of my father's generation that went to Japan in World War II, some of them brought back the aesthetic of Japan with them. That aesthetic included things like the martial arts, and included things like Japanese wives and families. It included the idea that their world was now open to a completely different point of view, a perspective that no American prior to that had unless they were incredibly well-traveled and unique. But now it was thousands of soldiers who had landed on beaches in Asia who brought back not just their memories of the war, but the memories of the people that they encountered who were decent and kind to them in many ways once this thing had unraveled, had unfolded. And so they brought back the martial arts. That was a big thing. It was a big thing in my life in particular because it was on television. There was Bruce Lee playing Kato under the Green Hornet. Then David Carradine came along and played Kung Fu on TV. And these were impressionable moments as a young kid. These were men with supernatural talents, like things that I didn't think a human could do. So at 11 years old, I start training in karate. And I do this the rest of my life. I'm continuing as a martial artist today. I train and I teach today. But this kind of thinking, this thinking from the Orient, as the old scholars would refer to it, what we would say today is Asian thought, is coming in and changing the mindset of all these people. And that's why we see the 50s and the 60s exploding in this cultural revolution to some extent. New ideas come in and they change the ability to contain or hold in place the old idea sets. Well, this is what was happening to me in the late 1980s. New ideas were coming in. I was being exposed to ways of thinking through my reading, through my going to seminars, through my questioning of the world myself, even through the formal education I was getting and looking at the questions of the mind. And I was studying some mathematics and physics at the time. And I could not contain the idea that what I was supposed to do was find a job that I could sit in for 40 years, step by step, move through a corporate ladder and eventually, retire 25, 30 years later. And they'd give me a gold watch, pat me on the back and say, thank you for your service. So now that's where I am. That's the existential angst.
Mm-hmm. A new dimension was passing through your tubes.
Yeah, exactly. This is the stuff that I'm putting in the tube, and the tube has no way to digest this new material.
And the tubes are expanding into a new type of container.
Yeah. I had to literally kind of build a new set of internal organs to deal with this new nourishment. This was something I had not grown up on. Mm-hmm. So there was no preparation for it. My body had to figure out how to deal with all this, and I do mean at some level my body. Mm-hmm. Because I think in terms of embodiment. I think that we live in the world in this corporeal way. We don't, we're not disembodied minds.
So tell me more about those new organs growing.
So I think that the main thing to tell you, and to not, bore the heck out of anybody who chooses to listen into us, is that these were organs of synthesis. So the big distinguishment here is that most of American education that I went through, so remember I was educated in the 1960s in elementary school, and I entered into my high school years, my secondary school in 1973, graduated in 77, and then entered into university and spent a lot of time in university, although I was bouncing around to different courses and taking different ideas, really exploring ideas. I thought that's why I was supposed to be there. And not necessarily hell-bent on getting them to award me with a certificate that said, good boy, you did what we asked you to. And so I was building a very strong commitment early on to what American education, Western civilization education looks like, which is fractionated. Separate ideas in separate areas of understanding. And there's a couple of people that I really love and pay a lot of attention to. One of them is John Gatto. John Gatto was an American educator who wrote a lot about education in the Western world, not just America, but in Europe as well. and the way that that education is presented and offered. And he makes this comment, and I'm not going to try to give you the exact wording that he uses, but the idea is absolutely on track. And that is, we send these kids to school and we get them engaged in an idea. So as an educator, he was looking at this through his eyes as an educator in classrooms. And now that the students engaged, they're really interested, and the bell rings, and for no reason other than the fact that the bell has rung, the student has to leave what they're interested in. Their fascination is disrupted, and they have to move on to the next subject.
Fractionation.
So they're studying literature, and they're reading some great book, and the teacher's having an interesting conversation with them. The bell rings for the next lesson, and they have to get up, put their book down, go to another room, maybe another teacher, and now they're going to be studying mathematics. And there's complete discontinuity between the relationships between these things. And Goddard says it's intentional. He said literally there was a design that is 100 plus years old to make sure that students actually never learn how to connect the information. So rather than having a synthetical or a synthesis of information, a way of understanding, they have a fractionated way of understanding. Mm-hmm. So everything is in its silo. You do this and it's separate from that. And our lives reflect that. We don't have synthetic lives. We don't have lives that are organized synthetically in terms of bringing things together. And we're different people, literally, because of that. So we go to work and we're, work Joe. And then we come home and we're family Joe. And then we go out and we're friend Joe. And then I'm by myself and I'm solo Joe. And then like my mind is torn apart because for years and years and years, I've been taught everything is separate from everything else. And yet, I know that you know this because we know each other a little bit. And that is, there's a perennial wisdom which suggests nothing is separate from anything else. And so that's what the new organs were about, is my mind was beginning to build the ability to synthesize all of these disparate streams of knowledge and understanding and information I was gathering, whether I was reading literally texts of the Taoist, which was interesting to me at the time, or whether I was studying the physics of David Bohm, which was also interesting to me at the time, or trying to make sense of the mathematics necessary to understand that physics. So I was looking at discrete, math and differential equations and quadratic equations and trying to understand how to do that math at the level required to make sense of the stuff I was interested in, which was physics. And the physics was helping me make sense of the way the universe is comprised. And the Taoists were talking about this is what the universe is. And all of a sudden, it was like, oh, they're all saying the same thing. So I'm going to make a big leap now for a second, because I know you want to go there eventually anyway. And that is Joseph Campbell talks about the monomyth. It's all one story. And somehow around, I'm going to say the age of 26, 27, that's what happened. My brain caught it's all one thing. And from there, everything was different. The existential angst was completely resolved. And a new formed ontological angst began to emerge, which was a whole different conversation.
Okay, let's pause for a second. So basically, all the wires kind of seemed to connect at a certain point, and there was this epiphany of connection where it all sort of synced up, and you say synergistically, or you're saying synthetically. It all synced up. Synthetically. It all synced up synthetically, and there was, we could say the lights came on, and then that initiated a new process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's look at it through a particular lens as well. Up to that point, we'll pick it up from right there. Everything is what it is, and the world is normal as I understand it to be. Because I've been taught this is what the world is. This is the way the world works, right? There's boys and there's girls, and there's dogs and cats, and there's houses and there's apartments, and there's these different things, and they're all separate from one another, even though they all exist in simultaneity. And I think of everything that way. I think of everything in terms of this or that. Mm-hmm. Everything's bifurcated. Everything's fractionated. Mm-hmm. Because I've been taught to look at the world in every way, from my parents all the way through all of my teachers, to all of my education, the books that I'm reading, the television I'm watching, the films I've been to, that it's a this or that thing. Now suddenly my mind grasps onto this idea that it really is this and that, and that, and that, and that, and that, and that. And it's like, if you can imagine being, standing in front of a tree at the edge of a forest, and all you can see is the bark of the tree. And then suddenly you're on a conveyor belt, which is moving backwards away from the forest. And it's happening at 1,000 miles an hour. So instantly, from seeing just bark in front of you and not even necessarily knowing what that is, except that it has a texture and a color and a form to it, you see a tree and you recognize, oh, that was the bark of the tree. And then instantly you see 20 trees and it's, oh, this is part of a grove. No, it's a forest. Oh my God, it's a huge part of a landscape. And there's, desert and there's water and all of a sudden you see the planet. And then you continue to move back into space and you see the sun and the other planet. And it's like all of a sudden, there's no separation. This is all of one thing. It's just where you're standing in relation to it. So the ontological question was, in that grand scheme of things, cosmologically, you might say, is where am I standing? Mm-hmm. And what I realized, 40 odd years later, is that's the function of choice. You get to be with your nose pressed up against a tree, or you get to be standing somewhere, near Alpha Centauri looking back into the solar system and seeing it from that perspective. So it really is the amazement of what it means to be human, is that we're part and parcel of this grand adventure experiment, and it won't be what it is without us, but we sure as heck don't contain it.
Well, let me take us back to the Neo visual reference, in that you say that in the end it's a matter of choice of where you're standing. But do you first have to get the unplugging? Do you have to first know that the reality that you think is real is actually the one that's not real, and that there's a different reality that you have choice within?
It's a great question. And what I would say is, from the experience I have of myself and the experience I've had talking with many, many other people who have been through personal transformations of various kinds, and from the clients I've worked with, which number in the thousands at this point, there has to be a kind of an awakening to the idea that what you call reality is a construct. Mm-hmm. And that construct isn't created actually out there, but it's created, you could say, in here. And the in here that we create from has been influenced and molded, shaped by all of the inputs that came in there, got jumbled up together in different ways for different people for different reasons, and then become the structure of reality. And then to a very great extent, what occurs is the societies that we're born into shape themselves to reinforce the reality construct that it wants its members to have. Mm-hmm. So in our society, to a very great extent, and I've talked about this extensively in some of my business consulting and some of the speeches and things I've done in that domain, we are organized around this idea of productivity. We're supposed to be productive. This is, again, if I go back to that grand, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ideal, it's to be productive, to make your life useful in many ways. That's the ideal. And useful means to produce something, to produce goods of some kind, to provide a service of some kind, to contribute economically in some way. And the question is, who are we serving when we do that? It's almost like there's the man behind the curtain pulling the levers and pushing the buttons and projecting the screenplay for us, so that we never get to see the connection to the service, the productivity, the production that we're creating in terms of who it really serves, because it doesn't really serve us. Right?
Yeah. Even now we're serving the algorithm.
I was just about to say, even if we're like Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg, and we've attained the heights of three-figure billion-dollar success, are we really serving ourselves by getting there? What's being served? Who's being served? Mm-hmm. Who's pushing the levers and pushing the buttons, and why? And I think to some extent, it's just the momentum of the system at this point. I don't think there's any particular singular evil genius who's sitting on a throne somewhere looking down on all of us like, I've got them all, It's not going on. That's not what's happening. It's the system has created such momentum in the direction of productivity that it broke the people that it was designed to serve. And now the people are simply cogs in the system, and they're running as fast as they can to be more successful because they don't know what success is, so therefore they can never quantify how successful they have to be successful enough. Mm-hmm. It's crazy. It's nuts.
Could you connect this back to your own journey, please?
So again, I think we pick up at that point where I have this awareness. And for the sake of continuity of the story, let's say,
right.
At this point, I've run into Roy Frazier, who's my mentor.
Okay, but sorry, there was one, I found it very intriguing that you described that you had this awareness of the fractionization, and at a certain point, everything flipped and got connected. So you had an awareness of connection, which we could call epiphany or light bulb moment. You didn't put any words to that I'm aware of. And from that point on, you said it began a new crisis. What was that about?
Well, it was almost as though the way that I would describe it simply is the veil of reality had torn. Everything I could count on before and understand and make sense of, and I knew what I was supposed to do or how I was supposed to do it, or the things I should aim at and why it was important to be like that or anything else, no longer had relevance. There were no buoys that I could use to guide myself or navigate these waters. There was no touch points that I could count on being what they were. And again, by no means is Joseph Riggio the only guy on the planet who's ever experienced this. This is, again, part of that literature of the perennial wisdom in the mythology, the stuff that Joe Campbell speaks to. And if you want to get it, the thing I recommend, and I did this for many years, I don't do it anymore, I'm going to go back to it probably because I love it, is I would be training in this process I developed called the MythoSelf Process. And I would get my class together. We'd get together 4 times a year. And we do 3 or 4 days of training together. And it was like all day. We'd start at like 10 o'clock in the morning, end at 10, 11 o'clock at night. We'd have a meal together. I always did it at like kind of retreat places where I could bring this whole group together. We'd take over the place and we'd run it. Really great experiences. And usually in the second of the 4-day sessions, which were a couple of months apart, I would, on the 3rd day, get the group together after dinner. And I'd make sure it was a big dinner. I'd arrange with the retreat to make sure it was a really big, heavy dinner. And we'd go back into the training room, and I'd have like soft chairs set up and pillows on the floor. I'd kick the heat up to about 80 degrees in the room, and I would shut all the lights off, and I'd have a small TV at the front of the room, and I would play the video from Tarkovsky, the great Russian director, The Stalker. And I did this for a number of different reasons, but the Stalker story is this guy who lives on the edge of an area where some event has happened. We don't know what the event is, but it's transformed this area into a place that's both dangerous and magical. And at the center of this area where this guy lives, at the center of the space that it's in, there's a room. And if you get to this room and in your mind, you voice your heart's desire, whatever you voice will come true. And Tarkovsky has this guy who lives there, and he's raising a family, and they're incredibly poor. His daughter is kind of malformed because the event was like a radioactive type event or something like that, and she came out deformed. He calls her Monkey. And he's living there to take care of her and support her by bringing people into this area. And he shows them the room so that they can get their heart's desire, and they pay him. And this is how he makes his money. But it's illegal to do this. So the movie always opens up in black and white, and then it goes to color, and you go through this thing. And this is what it's like. It's like every time he goes into the space where the room is, this domain, this landscape, he can't count on it being the same. So part of his skill is he would take like things he found, rocks, or there was some industrial waste there, so he'd find big bolts or nuts made of metal, and he'd tie like a piece of cloth around them and throw them, because sometimes they would just disappear, and he knew he couldn't go there. Sometimes they would land, and it would be water where there wasn't water before. So the way to get to the room was never the same twice. So every time he took a group of people in, he had to re-navigate this space, but there was no touch points. He had to use an internal sense of awareness of what the landscape was comprised of and how to move around it to get to the room and to get these people safely in and out of the area. And so this was, the fundamental idea. And I was introduced to this movie, by the way, by Roy Frazier, my own mentor. And I never quite understood when he first introduced it, why the heck is he talking about Tarkovsky as the stalker? And I went and watched it on my own. He never, brought it into the room the way I did. But I understood this was, in fact, his sense of himself. Roy perceived himself as the stalker, the person who led people into this psychological landscape, which is always subjective. So once you cross the threshold, you can't know what's going to be on the other side because it's not yours, it's theirs. And the challenge they have is they don't know what's on the other side. That's why they need a guide to guide them through. This is, again, the Joe Campbell idea of the guide, taking you into the subterranean psychological domain and navigating it with you. Because they know what the terrain is comprised of. They understand what's likely to be there, how the terrain is organized, even if they don't know the particular map that you're operating from. And Roy was the stalker. Roy was the guide in his mind. And so when I got that, again, this kind of flash of intuition, and I understand he's pointing out to me something that is a navigation tool that I can also use to understand you can't count on things being what you expect them to be. You have to be open to the moment and seeing it for what it is. Even if it's completely opposite of what you expect or desire for it to be, that's what it is. So that was the big change when the kind of veil of reality ripped and was torn for me. All the things I counted on, and I thought I understood how the world worked and relationships work and my life was supposed to be and the things I was supposed to do and the importance of this or that, the significance of material success, all of these things became abolished. And I had to reformulate a structure so that I could operate in relation to it about what was now important to me and worth investing in terms of time and energy and attention.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so basically reality was restructuring for you at that time. What you thought had been real, you discovered was not, and you were forming a new footing and finding new touch points at that time. And
giving up touch points.
Okay, giving up the old touch points.
So really, what happened was, and this is important if you want to get it, the thing that replaced the touch points were principles.
Oh.
So I could count on certain principles. Like one of the things I tell people all the time is if you want to engage with me around these ideas that we're talking about even here, I start from the premise that there is an extant manifest reality, that there is in fact material form. Now, while we may not know exactly what that is, or even how to describe it or make sense of it, I really presume that the chair that I'm sitting on as I'm speaking to you will remain here, whether or not I hold it as such in my consciousness. Even if I imagine it dissolving and disappearing as hard and as intensely as I can, it seems to have some manifest way of continuing to hold me in place. So I accept there's a manifest reality outside of myself, by the way, which includes you. I think you actually exist and aren't a figment of my imagination or a projection of my consciousness.
Okay, so I would link this to what you were describing with the movie The Stalker, that you had to become versed in the underlying principles that were reliable. Those were the new touch points because the underlying principles were what were certain in the midst of the ever-changing kind of old touch points that you now knew was not reality. So you had to learn to navigate in a whole new way, and you started to do it through principles.
So the distinction here of how to do it differently was to kind of begin from a position of doubt. And the doubt wasn't external, it was internal. So there was an acceptance, as I just said, that what's on the outside actually exists. My perception of what's on the outside is very questionable. Am I perceiving what's there, or am I projecting something over what's there and perceiving my own projections?
You began to question your perception.
Right. And what that did is it, over many, many years, starting at the very first time I could engage in that process, you might call it, refined my ability to distinguish my projections and some of the sensory inputs that I was receiving. So in a way, what's real for me has become what happens as a result of the perception to action loops that I engage in.
Mm-hmm.
All of the information between perception and action may or may not be real. I can't know that with certainty. But I can know that my perceptions are real to me. And when there's a congruency between what I perceive and act upon and the result of the action I take, manifesting a projection, a perception that matches the expectation I have, I presume that that's as real as I can get.
So you have certain clues in the midst of that investigation, and one of them is congruency, which is one of those affirming principles that helps you to validate that a perception is...
It's congruency of expectation.
Okay, great. Could you please time slide us back and introduce Roy Frazier, because he is a mythical figure and plays such a huge role in your journey. And I lost where it is that he comes in and how he was participating in this really cosmic reframe for you.
I mentioned Warner Earhart.
Yes.
So let's just put a date on it so we can have some sense of chronological continuity, right? So let's say around 1984, 85, my world starts getting a little shook up a bit. I'm coming out of a period just prior to that where I was really a nomadic. I wasn't living in any one place. I was actually bouncing around and doing a bit of what they call today sofa surfing. And I had friends and relatives, and I was visiting. I wasn't necessarily just camping out on sofas and because I didn't have a place to go, but I was literally trying to engage with people who at that time were important in my life. And so these were friends and family, and I'd go visit them and I'd stay with them for a couple of days or a couple of weeks. And I had a home. It wasn't that I didn't have somewhere to go, but I was very seldom there compared to the amount of time I spent on the road. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times I would just get in a car and I'd drive to go somewhere, and I'd wind up somewhere close enough to someone I knew, and I'd say, hey, I'm in the area. You got a couple of days I can hang out for a bit before I move on. They almost always said yes. If not, I found a small hotel or motel I could crash in and continue the journey. So I was really living nomadically from probably 1980 to 85, I would say, is realistic time frame.
Sounds like existential Jack Kibak.
Yeah, exactly. Little minor mini Jack Kibak experience, right? And I was really having a great time. Actually, I was really loving the process of being on the road. At that time, I was training dogs, and it was really a good time for me to be doing that because it allowed me to be anywhere and to make a bit of a living. And I was also a partner in an architectural firm, so I had to show up on occasion there as well. And so there was a lot of activity going on. And in that activity, I was doing a lot of reading. I was, as I said, back in those days, some of us will remember, they had this thing called a cassette tape. And there was one always playing in my car in the cassette player. And these were all kind of new age tapes. I was listening to guys like Alan Watts and some of the lectures of Thomas Merton. What I was saying is there was this guy who used a Scottish accent to channel some non-corporeal entity and share wisdom from this non-corporeal entity, who I remember listening to because he was fascinating and going, every time I listened to him, you're so full of shit. This is like classic neuroscience material. This is classic philosophical material. This is like, stuff from the spiritual literature. You just reformulate it with a Scottish accent and a non-corporeal entity that you speak through, right? Anyway, so that's the kind of stuff I was doing. And we're talking hours and hours and hours of this because I was driving all over, training dogs, hanging out with people, running back to the office to try to do as little architecture as I could to get by and satisfy what I committed to my partners doing. And then I am married, whole nother chapter we don't need to go into deeply. Mm-hmm. Wonderful woman, have a child with her, my oldest son, and 2 years later decide that she and I are absolutely not on the same trajectory, and deeply in love with her, by the way, at the time, and recognizing that if I stick around, that will transform into hate and disgust, and she won't like me, and so we should get apart while we love each other, but recognize we're not meant to live together. So we did that, and we got separated and eventually divorced. I go to her house multiple times a year and have dinner these days with my current, and so it's a good thing. But I was now back actually at my parents' house. I moved back in, not knowing where I was going to go, kind of had to put a stake in the ground again to just figure out what I was going to do next. And I had, for the year just prior to this, as I was kind of going through the final stages of separating from my ex, I was studying neurolinguistic programming, NLP. And I had just come across it. I literally bounced into a brochure in some health food shop, and it looked interesting. And so I joined up. And at the end of that first year's training, I wanted to continue, but I wanted to find somebody who was magical, because I had met Richard Bandler, and I realized Richard was totally magical character, and I wanted to study with somebody who was totally magical. And so I went to everywhere, talked to everyone, went to seminars, tried to find the next person I was going to kind of spend time with. And I went down to this training in Pemberton, New Jersey, which is on the edge of the New Jersey Pine Barrens, which is, again, a whole story unto itself.
Yes.
And met this guy, Roy Frazier. And we can do the Roy Frazier, meeting up story at some point if you like. But basically,
yes,
Roy is a magician in this transformational space. So I find out very early on in meeting with Roy and spending time with him, he spent 25 years in Israel as a commando in the Israeli army. He left there, comes to the United States, and is going around kind of doing a little bit of what I did. He went and studied bioenergetics. He was doing psychodrama. He did hypnosis training. He met some of the spiritual guru trainers that were hanging out in the United States, and stumbles upon, as I did, neurolinguistic programming, and gets an introduction from somebody to Richard Bandler, to meet Richard. And Richard and Roy, they just meet and they get together like this. They're just, buddies from day one, right? And the thing is, Roy goes very deeply into this technology. He starts running NLP trainings, and now I'm signed up. And I'm on board. I'm apprenticing. I'm not going to seminars. I'm going there pretty much every week, 40 odd weeks a year, 2 to 5 days at a time. And every penny I have that I can earn, beg, borrow, and steal, I'm putting into this training and development. I do that for 7 years. So Roy Frazier was absolutely the most developmental character in my journey. He was, the Obi-Wan Kenobi or Yoda of my life, if you want to call it. And, probably more akin than those two to, Don Juan of Carlos Castaneda fame. I was going down to Pemberton, New Jersey, and as I say, he lives on the edge of the Pine Barrens. He bought a farm that was fallow, and I don't know how many acres he had. He had a number of acres that were in the backfield that I really never spent much time in or did much in. I walked around a little bit. But on the front end of the property, nearest the road, there was a house that he lived in. And behind that house, there was a garage that had been built by the people who owned it prior to him. They were mechanics. And they had built a 3-car garage that they could do work in and fix cars in. And he turned that into what he called the hypnotorium. And the hypnotorium was this building in which he did and taught hypnosis and NLP. And next to that, so if you can imagine, you're on the road and you pull into the driveway, and immediately to your right, there's a house. Let's say you drive another 100, 150 feet, and the hypnotorium is directly in front of you. So just to the right of the hypnotorium, if you're facing it, there's a pond. But this pond is an acre or so big. It's not a tiny little pond. It's quite huge. And this pond was in the direct line of the migratory route of many of the water birds that were flying between the north and south on the east coast of the United States. So we'd be working there, sitting at the edge of the pond in, somewhere between May and October, and egrets and great blue herons and all kinds of these beautiful, beautiful birds would come down. There were hawks in the area on the farm, and it was just it was like going to Tolkien's Middle Earth. It was a magical place. And for me, it was the experience of stepping into a magical world, of being transported out of reality and the constructs of reality as I knew them to be, not just in terms of the physical space, which it was, but the ideas that Roy was sharing, and this idea of being responsible for your own mind and taking back control of remembering who you were before anybody had interrupted the experience of being yourself. And then also recognizing all of these input signals of how you were corrupted, if you want to call it that, with tiny, what he would call sensitizing imprints that would constantly bump you away from that realization of living yourself, of being ontologically true to yourself, and building a false ontology. So recently, I did a program that I called The Persona, and it was about this idea of how we build personas that become for us more real than ourselves. And this is really what happened with Roy. So over those 7 years, there were two things that were occurring in parallel, and they were really significant. One was this constant remembering with me, the who I am question before the interruptions occurred, before all the sensitizing imprints, and kind of clearing all of that out of the way. Till I eventually got back to the point where this whole form rendering of reality that I had experienced just before I met him was making sense. Of course, this is how it is. This is how it's always been. All the other stuff was imposed bullshit, right? That had become real for me. My persona was for me more real at 22 than Joseph was. At 29, that had exploded. By 34, Joseph became more real again. And so now I'm experiencing this second parallel track that I was mentioning with Roy.
Let me just ask you, what are you calling Joseph? What are you calling Joseph?
The true sense of being oneself, the original ontological template or imprint that we come into the world with.
Okay.
So there's a way of being for everyone that everyone knows. Everybody knows. I haven't met anybody yet. I said I've worked with thousands of clients. When you tap into it, you touch upon it, they will go, yeah. And yeah means, yeah, I get that this is the real me, but if I do this, it usually means I have to give up all these other kinds of successes and achievements and accomplishments that I've worked so hard for, that I was told what I was supposed to be doing. And I have to give up the idea that those things I told were most important are actually not most important. And I've got to choose between being the false self that I've learned to accommodate with all of those things that are quote unquote really important, and being who I am. And I'm going to give you mytho language, right? The language of the model I built. This is the distinction. When you're truly yourself, the only way to make sense of the world that makes any sense is through an aesthetic lens. When you're living in relation to your persona, the only way to make sense of the world that makes any sense is through a sociological pragmatic lens, doing what society tells you is important to do, serving society. Okay.
So persona on one end, you're using that as a term to describe sort of the matrix self, the constructed sense of self that serves society, and society has also in great part constructed it so that the individual will serve in a kind of an infinite loop. And then the persona, and what is the other what word would you put to that? The true self? You used your own name for yourself.
You're going, yeah. I mean, when you're who you are, what I said is that you're constantly referencing an aesthetic lens.
Okay, so who you are aesthetically, can we call it that?
We could. I would say who you are ontologically is more accurate.
Okay.
So it's the ontological self.
Ontological self. Okay.
Which, by the way, is not always pragmatic.
What do you mean by that?
The easiest way to make sense of it, if you look at a child, especially a mischievous child, there are times where they get that kind of glint in their eye, where they know what they're doing, they're not supposed to be doing, but they know they're going to do it anyway. So they've got the bowl of spaghetti in front of them. And in the moment, they realize that tomato sauce and finger paint are very similar. And they're looking at you to hold your gaze as they're surreptitiously moving their hand into their pasta dish so they can get enough tomato sauce on it to draw on the table, or the tablecloth. Right? And they know they're going to get in trouble. They're hoping they can charm their way out of it and have you think it's as funny as they think it's going to be.
So that's the part you're calling non-pragmatic, that basically
Right.
there's a sense of, there's a call to mischief that is greater than consequence.
There's a call to being playful.
Call to being playful. That supersedes any negative repercussions.
Right. So on an adult level, it might be this. The hunter goes out and has to feed his family or her family. And they're hunting for a whole day. Let's say it's early winter. It's getting cold. And they come across a beautiful deer. And the deer is in the position where they could easily take it down and they could dress it and take it home and feed the family. But in that moment, for some reason, something strikes them that the deer is so beautiful in this environment, so perfectly fit to what's happening in that moment, that to rip it from that scene would do more damage than good. And they choose to go home hungry versus in that moment killing the deer.
Mm-hmm. So that's,
this is as opposed to what society tells us.
Mm-hmm.
The hunter goes out. Let me give this the example. And the hunter has already caught a deer. They've dressed it. They've got it on their shoulder, and they're carrying it home. This hunter sees that same deer and can't help themselves but to kill it because more is better. So they don't need the deer. They're already going to be able to feed their family. But the fact that there's an opportunity for them to take it is so overwhelmingly programmed into them that they have no choice but to kill it and rend it from that perfect structure that it's part of. Because for them, the only sane thing to do is to accumulate, to have more than they need. So even if that second deer's meat rots, better that it rots for them than it's left there and possibly for someone else to take. Right? So this is really a deep message in our society. Mm-hmm. And anybody who lives aesthetically and goes home hungry and leaves the deer there because it was just simply too beautiful to kill is insane, according to our society.
How does that connect to Joseph Campbell? Where would he place that?
Well, you'd have to explore the much larger constructs of mythology. Mm-hmm. So the easiest way to do that is to look at what Joseph Campbell says are the reasons for mythology to be so prominent in human experience. He said the reasons are cosmological, sociological, psychological, and individualistic or functional. Pragmatic. So one aspect of mythology is this pragmatic aspect. Here's how to do things that you need to learn to do. And the early mythologies are here's where to find water. Here's how to track an animal. Here's how to make sure the soil stays fertile. Those are the early mythologies. The new mythologies are here's how to get on the Bitcoin, escalation before it peaks. But that's the pragmatic. That's the individual pragmatic structure.
Survival.
The psychological structure is the answering of the question, who am I? Mm-hmm. Who do I know myself to be? The cosmological structure is what is the universe? What is the mystery of the universe? What is it revealing to me? Mm-hmm. And the psychological structure is what is society teaching, or the sociological, structure is what is society teaching? What does it want me to know? How do I behave in a way that allows me to fit in so that I don't become an outcast? So the way that story fits in is it's really, in a way, I would argue, the distance between the cosmological and the functional. There are some people who have such a resonant attachment to or awareness of the cosmological that they allow it to become the signature that they organize the functional in relation to. For most people, the sociological, the societal structure has interrupted that connection and said, we're going to give you all of the things that you need to put attention on that are important. The cosmological is almost fantastical and fantasy. Unless you're a child, you'll ignore that. So have your attention on the functional. When you develop an ontological awareness, you can't help but go back into the psychological and cosmological to want to know who you are and what you are, and in relation to the grand mystery of what it is to be alive and to be human and to be part of this universe. Mm-hmm. And nothing can satisfy you as a human being if you don't answer those fundamental questions. Who am I? Why do I exist? What's my relationship to this big event called life? Mm-hmm. So of course you need more. You got to kill this. You have to kill the second deer because you're yearning, you're striving for satisfaction, to have a sense of being satisfied. But since you're doing everything in a way that can never satisfy you, you keep striving to do something that will give you a sense of deep, profound satisfaction, bring the system to rest, as I say. And it's never going to happen with the pursuit of those external objects.
Mm-hmm. The myth of Sisyphus.
Mm-hmm. But Sisyphus got there by doing something that was not practical. The reason he's has to push the rock up the cliff, right? Prometheus, whose liver gets eaten every day by the eagle. Why did you give fire to the humans? It's not practical. You could have lived a life of grandeur as a god, but you chose to do this stupid thing, care for others.
The punishment of choosing the ontological, perhaps.
So a lot of that was present in what I was going through with Roy. There was the learning of the skill set, how to notice for this, how to work with people, how to help guide people on the path that would lead them to this, and the coming to the realization of what it meant for me as a person, myself, so that I would have the template internally. And ultimately, the work that I do, a lot of the time is really about standing in the space in such a way that people can see what it looks like to stand in the space.
So from that magical and mystical Middle Earth time period with Roy emerged your ability to stand in a space and help others to stand in a space of their own.
And a ton of work, yes.
A lot of time, space, and work involved.
And a lot of sacrifice. Again, the walking away from a marriage with a woman that I was in love with, mm-hmm. the moving out of a comfortable life of relative ease, practicing architecture, recognizing that wasn't the fundamental calling, and giving up the income and the success and the recognition that was associated with that, moving back into a single room in my parents' house, spending years, doing work that allowed me the freedom and the ability to earn enough income to continue to study with Roy and make that my primary occupation so I could gain the skills. Getting a lot of negative feedback from the world around me that I wasn't using my intelligence or my abilities or my credentials in a way that made sense to anybody but me. Spending hours and hours and hours reading esoteric material. There were a huge amount of sacrifice in those 7 years mm-hmm. to come to terms with knowing myself to be who I am today.
Well, at risk of being simplistic, I am fascinated by how this all does as well fit into the Joseph Campbell journey. I mean, we could say that you got your call to adventure, and then could we say that entire passage of difficulty was a dark night of the soul or sort of an extended swamp, or where would you place that?
All those terms make sense. So when you look at Joseph Campbell's, graphical representation of the journey, you see a circle, and the circle is bisected by a line. The line that bisects the circle represents what you could call the external manifest world. And the bottom half of the circle that's now been created by that bisecting line is the internal, subterranean world of one's psychic self. And the journey that Campbell describes is you leave the world proper and you enter into this subterranean space of your internal awareness, your internal cosmos, to explore what's there, to unpack it, if you will, in a way that it reforms when you are prepared to re-enter the world proper. And all of that time, all of that journeying is spent going through the material that's present in that psychological space. And what you recognize is very little of it is your material. The vast majority of what you confront there was imposed and installed in your interactions in the world with others.
The tube
So
is
he
full
talks
of other
about-
people's bad food turned into S.
Yeah,
And you need a massive colonic.
exactly. And so as you're sweeping the material ahead of you, hopefully so that it can excrete itself. Well, what you're realizing is, you got all these things that Campbell refers to. You've got the threshold guardians, right? You've got the monsters at the gate. You've got the magic helper who's going to help you defeat the monster. You've got all these different characters and archetypes, I guess you might want to refer to them as, that you're going to meet in this journey and have to deal with. And, there's these great stories. I mean, Joe Campbell, the reason that his stuff is so good, in my opinion, is because he's so tuned into the stuff that was so good from the beginning of time. Whether you want to read Homer's epics, I think the Odyssey is the classic hero's journey. You read about Ulysses, and everybody has this issue with the Greeks and their writing that is very paternalistic and masculine. That's because they're not reading it. That's because they read about it. But if you read the Odyssey, Penelope's the most solid rock in the whole damn story. She's at home holding the space intact, making sure her son's raised properly, keeping the suitors at bay, holding the kingdom together, and is the cleverest person in the whole damn story, who, weaves every night at the loom and then unweaves it when the suitors go to sleep so that she doesn't have to marry him. I mean, just brilliant stuff, right? So the story lays out the journey from 5 or 6 different points of view of what it is to be the hero. And the hero doesn't come home. Ulysses does not arrive on the shore of his kingdom with a treasure chest of gold, right? He's left behind everything that was traditionally important. He has to walk away from Calypso. And Calypso basically says, if you stay with me, I'll make you a god. And he gives it up to get back to his family. And he arrives on the shore, not just penniless, but in an agreement, with the gods, a god in particular, to turn him into the visage of an old man so nobody can recognize him. And this penniless, old, humbled creature is how he returns. Right? And only by going through that experience does he get a chance to find himself as who he is. So it's humbling. You call it the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul is a humbling experience. You will not be glorified. Trust me. If you think this is about becoming glorified, you're not on the journey that I have been on.
So you've passed through that swamp, that dark night, that humbling. And tell me about the circle as it continues to go around towards the point of origin.
Yeah. If you can imagine the circle, and you imagine on the circle, the line goes from left to right or right to left. And at those 2 points, at the extreme left, extreme right, extreme left, is the point where you're at the threshold between the manifest world and the underworld, the world of the psychic, right? And halfway between that, if you drew a vertical line that bisected the circle in the other direction, at the very bottom of the image, you would have the point where you enter into the facing of oneself, right? You have to kind of, in Star Wars, he went into the tunnel, the cave. So this is often the story. Jonah goes into the mouth of the whale, right? Trying to think, Orpheus goes into hell, right? There's all these images of going under, going down into something that's dark and foreboding. And in all cases, what happens is that's the moment at which you've done the work. You've done all the work you need to do to prepare yourself to look in the mirror and truly see, probably for the first time, what looks back at you. That's the humbling. Right? It's not Aladdin. It's not the Arabic tale where when you find yourself, you're clothed in, golden threaded, cloth, and you have a crown on your head and you come into town. It's the humbling, even in that story, is he has to admit who he is, the poor peasant boy from the streets. Right? But in doing that, he comes upon a great power. There's a great power that's revealed to him in coming to himself. This is what happens in the cave, is that you let everything go, and the only thing that's left is you. And then you recognize that's enough to carry you through everything. That's what the humbling is. And you give up the attachment to the external representations, the credentials, the material goods, the status, the fame, the money in the bank, the car that you drive, the house you live in, the neighborhood you live in, the beautiful person you're married to or hope to marry, the success of your children. All of that's not there. It's there. It's not that it doesn't count or matter in any way, because we live in the real world. But at the same time, it's not what matters most. What matters most is to be able to wake up, to look in the mirror, and to see the truth of what looks back. And then from there, you prepare yourself again to come back into the manifest world. But you come back into the manifest world at that point, Joseph Campbell tells us, with the gift. He calls it the boon, the elixir, the talisman, right? The sacred marriage of atonement with God. All of these different ways of, you've now done what you had to do to resolve the deep existential wound. Because there's a deep wound that got you on this journey in the first place. You recognized there's something not right in the way it is right now. I want something other than this, right? Which, by the way, is always the doorway to misery, as I say. My phrase is to want something to be any other way than the way it is. So that's what got you on the journey. You walked through the doorway of misery and you were humbled. And in that humbling, you prepared yourself to receive the gift you're going to bring back into the world. And that gift is always yourself. I tell this story. When my children were born, I was still an ignorant shithead. Okay? So I'm in my 20s, when my son was born at least, and I'm just beginning this journey. And I think it's all about becoming wonderful and great and elite and, blah, 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 blah. Become a magician who's going to transform the world. All that bullshit. And so when my son is born, I figure that my role is, to be the guide, to now raise him and make him everything that he can be, and all that other stuff that parents hope and dream for. The reality is, it's only when I'd gone far enough into this process to experience what I'm calling the humbling, to go into the cave and to look and see who was looking back, that I realized that was never the case. My children are the gift. And my job is to give them the space not to become what I think they should be or who I think they should be, but the space to become themselves, to keep everything out of their way as much as possible that would corrupt them more than they're capable of uncorrupting themselves from. And this is what I mean by the gift. It's that realization that whatever the gift is that you're given is not for you. It's for you to give to the world. And it's mostly invisible. It mostly won't bring you fame or success or recognition or wealth. If it's truly the gift and it's truly what you're supposed to be doing, it has to be given in such a way that there's no expectation of payment or return or remuneration of any kind. This is incredibly hard for somebody to get in our society. This is incredibly difficult because they go on these journeys with the expectation that they'll get something miraculous by doing it, right? Including fame and success and wealth. If I do this right, I'll find that person. My soulmate will become available to me. All these different kinds of ideas that have been bred in and corrupted the fundamental story, in my opinion. You keep talking about Joseph Campbell. He's pointing to these fundamental stories which share these direct ideas without the corruption of social, desire, let's call it, on them. And so, the idea that you will manifest that which you resonate is like one of the stories that's told currently in a lot of the space that we're kind of on the edge of, let's call it that. And if we do the right things, we'll begin to resonate at the level which all our dreams will become manifest and fulfilled.
Are you referring to like the secret kind of mentality?
Yeah, kind of. Whether it comes from The Secret or that laws of attraction or the manifestation literature. And this literature stretches all over the place. It's in religious texts. It's all over the place. A lot of the current religions where you see some of these preachers out there who are living in multi-million, billion-dollar lifestyles are manifest because they're telling people if you do the right thing, you follow the right rules, you live the right lifestyle, God will reward you. You'll also get a Rolls Royce. And it's a corruption of the fundamental story. The fundamental story is if you do the right thing and live the right way, you'll have your life. That's what you get. You get to have your life, not the imposition of a life that was designed by someone else for you. That's the only gift you get. That's the gift. You get to have your life. Right? And then in doing that, the desire to have a beautiful wife or a handsome husband or a pocket full of gold or whatever, it goes away. It no longer matters. Like, for instance, wealth becomes a tool that you can use to accomplish the things that are important for you. Some of that might be a quality of life. I like eating good food and sleeping in fine hotels and enjoying fine clothing. I get to do those things to some extent. But I recognize these are non-important. These are trivial. The non-trivial is, when I bought that beautiful shirt that I get to wear, how did I treat the guy who sold it to me? That's non-trivial. The particular shirt I'm going to wear for the next 3 or 4 years till it wears out is trivial. That moment of interaction and relationship is non-trivial. I get to carry that for the rest of my life. And I know that because there are moments that went well and moments that went poorly that I'm still carrying around. Now, I don't dwell on them, and they don't create for me an obsession, but they do create for me a sense of, as you put it earlier, how to navigate. They become part of the principle set of when it shows up like this in the future, I now know something about what to do in relation to it that puts me on the right path.
Learning moments that become almost like talisman for you back to principles.
Right. So Joe Campbell says this is what we get to take back. We go through this humbling, we go through the cave, we see ourselves. We're given something as a result of that, because what we're given is the freedom to live our lives and the necessity of what it would take to do that, whether it's, again, the elixir, the talisman, the token, right? We resolve the historical disenfranchisement in the atonement or the sacred marriage. All of that happens for us. We come together to know ourselves. The sacred marriage, of course, is the co-joining internally within oneself of the male and the female, animus and anima, right? And that realization that we are a complete and whole entity. So the other thing that begins to happen is we stop manifesting either expression of persona, which is an excessive manifestation of femininity or an excessive manifestation of masculinity. So a man represents himself as a man, but addresses all of those things which in society are often considered extremely feminine. There are things like their sense of ability to be nurturing and to be sentimental become available to them in an expressed way. Right? But they don't hyper sentimentalize. And they don't go to extremes in being so nurturing that they can't be disciplined. Right? And the same thing when a woman enters it, she accesses all of those masculine traits without becoming hard or harsh.
That's probably what the
So,
yin yang symbol was referring to, that it's both there in a wholeness.
right. And so that's the sacred atonement. So whatever it is that you need, whatever it is that's missing for you, so to speak, is rejoined to you.
Mm-hmm.
So the forgetting that happened so that you could fit in and be good, become part of society wants you to be, is now remembered again, and you once again know yourself to be whole.
Mm-hmm.
That which had been lacking is now present for you. You're full.
And it's not that you're not in society again. Could you reconnect this back to your own journey, that you went through this dismantling and a remantling, and then you described there was a lot of sacrifice, and we could say the metaphor of turbulence in the airplane. But then if we stay with that circle, once you had attained your true self, the Joseph, as we were calling it earlier, the ontological self, how did that journey proceed from there?
Less turbulent, not non-turbulent. So the thing that happens is it wasn't a singular event or moment in time. I didn't come out of the days of unwakefulness into full wakefulness, and it stayed that way permanently without any challenges. It was, I now recognize I had a choice to act from an ontological position or to act from what I'm going to call, again, this social pragmatic position.
Mm-hmm.
And there were challenges. I went back and forth many different times where the attractions of the world were definitely tempting. And I felt the pull from my center that I was slightly off balance and had to come back again. But I now had the skills and knowledge of how to do that. But if we go back again for a moment to that diagram, we've now crossed that low point in the drawing, the bottom of the circle. And we're now on our way back in. We've received a gift and we have to cross the threshold back into the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we cross the threshold back into the world, Campbell says there's two possibilities. We become the Buddha, the teacher, we share our gifts with others, or we become the hermit and we go to the cave and we go, okay, now that I know, there's no place for me in the world because the world is not real. So I'm going to live, in a way, in the dream of my own realization.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I came back and kind of made more of the choice to, be the Buddha, the teacher, if you want to call it that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to share some of the understanding as I'm capable of, to the extent I'm capable of, with others. And so as you enter the world, he says the return to the world, crossing the threshold back in, is as challenging as it was to get to the threshold and cross it going in. And the reason is that no one wants you to be who you've become. They want you to be who you were. So when you show up in the world and you're ontologically whole to any extent, whether that's, you're a dragon on earth, as the Chinese would say, or you're just slightly awake, it doesn't matter. What's going to happen is that provokes and challenges others who recognize the possibility, but aren't prepared to do the trials. Mm-hmm. And so as you're coming back into the world, especially the people who knew you best, the family, the friends, the people who knew you before you'd gone through these trials and tribulations, will go, who do you think you are? There's a great scene. There's a comedian out there. His name is Joe Coy. He's a Filipino and grew up, I think he was born in the Philippines and then came to the United States with his family as a very young kid, grew up in kind of one of the ghettos of LA as a Filipino kind of ethnic kid and became a comedian. And he tells this story, and he's very funny when he tells it. I'm not going to make it as funny as Joe Coy does. And he tells this story that he's, talking to his parents, and he has this conversation. They're like, so Joe, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with your life, Joe? Joe, you've got to do something. You got to make a living. What are you going to do, Joe? And he goes, well, I'm going to be a comedian. And he goes, at this point, my mother looks at me very seriously and goes, Joe, who taught you were funny? You think you're funny? You're not funny, Joe. Go get a job, And this is a story you'll hear over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. right? One of the guys I paid a lot of attention to in that period of like absorbing all this information coming in, late 1980s, early 1990s, was Tom Brown Jr. Tom Brown Jr. is known as the tracker, right?
Yes.
And he tells this story
I'm a
that he
huge fan
learns
of Tom
from.
Brown Jr.
Yeah, I mean, I've met Tom. He's an incredibly fascinating guy. And one of the things that he tells a story about is he's realized that he's going to do this for the rest of his life. He's going to be a tracker. He's going to put all his energy, his attention there. He's happy to walk naked into the Sonora Desert and try to live there for 2 months as he is to, sit down and have a meal at home that's been cooked by somebody and prepared with love, right? And he's just at ease with himself in this particular way. He's in touch with himself and the world as he knows it to be. So he basically is sitting home one day. I recall the way he wrote about it. His father says, so, okay, you're graduating high school. What are you going to do? You're going to go to college or you're going to get a job. He goes, well, I don't want to go to college. That's not my thing. He goes, I'll get a job. He goes, great, Joe. Great, Tom, rather. What are you going to do? He goes, I'm going to be a tracker. He goes, oh, really? He goes, that's great. He goes, the New York Times newspaper's over there for me. Will you grab it for me? And so he goes and grabs it and he goes, let me see that section, the classified section. Can you show me all the jobs for tracker? And of course, there aren't any jobs for tracker. And so this is what happens. It's not that these people are malicious or mean ill for you. It's that they have no framework to hang upon the ideas of the transformation you've experienced to recognize who you are and the calling, this true, deep, profound, manifest calling to follow your own life. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you an example. There's a woman that I worked with who was very, very successful in every way that the society would point to as being successful. Highly educated, accomplished in university, big job, big money, lots of recognition and fame and acknowledgement in that domain, extremely capable, skillful. And she's now, when I talked to her first, probably 32, maybe about to be 33. And she decides more than anything else, what she wants to do is to be a mother and to raise children. And to do that the way she wants to, she has to exit that life completely. She doesn't want to part-time raise her children. She wants to be a full-time mother. That's what she wants to do. And the amount of grief that she got in her life is what led her to me, not from herself, but from everyone around her who was convinced that she had somehow had a walking nervous breakdown and needed treatment and therapy, and was so confused as to what was important as to really almost needing to have an intervention to be committed. So this is just what people will do. But for her, there was a profound sense of calling to that. And she did it. She actually walked away, and she wasn't married at the time. She wound up meeting someone very shortly thereafter. They are still together. This is 25 years ago now. And she is, in a great relationship, has maintained that marriage, has had 4 children, raised those children full-time as a mother, is very active in many of the community social activities around her, and very successful doing those, of course. She brings the same skill set and competence to it. School systems and external events and associations. Highly recognized in the community as somebody who makes huge contributions to the community, but would never have been any of that, could never have achieved any of that had she not stepped away. And to step away, she had to endure all these kind of slings and arrows of others. So I'll tell you a Roy story, since you want to hear some Roy stuff. Roy one time tells a story about going to a conference and how he was presenting ideas which were controversial. And he was in the space of the work that he did, this transformational work. And he said there were a lot of people there who realized that he had a target on his back, so they were slinging arrows at him. And of course, I'm being very clever, and I'm a master of metaphor in my mind, not in reality. And so I go, oh, good thing you have thick skin. And he was telling this story to a group of people, and I interrupted him, is really what happened. And very smoothly, without calling me obviously out on the carpet, just turned very casually and looked at me and said, no, Joseph, good thing I'm made of smoke. Nothing could land. And this is really part of the magical learning. You have to become smoke. So to enter back into the world, you have to become that person regardless of how much is thrown at you. None of it has a place to land.
become smoke. Does that
So that
connect
was,
to the Buddha teacher or to Dudism in any way?
we introduced a new subject, I see. So
Well,
the,
I'm just curious of the forms, you know, in the emergent form that we don't see much of because, like you said, fundamentally it's smoke. So where do we even get to see that modeled? It's so
well,
rare.
it's all over. It's not rare. It's just rarely seen. So
Explain that,
how
please.
many stories have told this story from beginning of time? Many of are now written and available and accessible. Films that have been made telling this story over and over and over again, right? And really the challenge is you have to get to the point where you're condensed enough within yourself that what emanates from you is a pure form, a sense of purity. And it's absolutely, non-negotiable, we could say, and therefore non-dissolvable in the face of these slings and arrows that others are presenting you, against you. And the idea here is that you will experience an onslaught of what feels like aggression, what feels like attack. And the instinct you'll have from your past life, so to speak, will be to defend yourself or to be injured by it, to be shamed or to feel angry or rageful towards the person who's doing the attack. If you've really crossed the threshold and you can contain that gift that you've received, you recognize this has nothing to do with you. They're not speaking about you. Even if what they're saying is accurate, even if I say, so Alicia, you seem to be wearing a mauve-colored top today. So even if my observation is accurate, I'm not speaking about you. I'm telling you what I notice. I'm telling you more about Joseph than Alicia. And no matter what it is, whatever somebody says, they're revealing themselves. And the key is in this moment, as they reveal themselves, you no longer need to have compassion for yourself because you're realized. I know who I am. I know my flaws. I know my weaknesses. I know my strengths. I know my good points. I know my bad points. I know it all. And it's all of one thing. It doesn't. None of it is separate from. So I have compassion for you. I have compassion that all you can notice about me is what you notice. So if you fall madly in love with me, I have compassion for you because you don't see those flaws and those weaknesses. If all you see are my flaws and weaknesses, and I aggravate you because I hold a position which is opposite or feels oppositional to your own, then I recognize you can't see the way that I connect to the world with an intention for good and for the well-being of others. So it doesn't matter what you think. It's your thoughts. This is not about me. And so that's how you enter the world. That's how you become smoke, is you have such a fully realized sense of self that there's nothing anyone could say about you that you don't already know if it's true and would be unwilling to say about yourself. You know
So the
yourself
smoke,
yourself
being
on
smoke
time.
is where it's you own yourself so fully that it's not about you.
That's right. No one can ever speak about me more than I can speak about me myself. And if someone does, if somebody points out something that I now recognize I've been unwilling to speak or recognize, realize, acknowledge about myself or within myself, then the only appropriate response is to be thankful and to update.
That's so beautiful. And would you forgive me for tying this with an absurd bow? Now that you've become smoke, is that why you hang out at cigar bars?
Well, I don't know if it's why I hang out at cigar bars. That may be one of the flaws that I'm willing to admit, right? Is that I am absolutely an Epicurean with a certain olfactory gustatory drive that I choose to indulge, So
But that's part of your true self,
I can
isn't
tend
it?
to be the glutton. I can have a few gluttonous moments in my life.
And nobody can criticize you for that more than you're already aware of it in yourself.
But you can use the cigar to, create a smoke-like phantom of yourself and get away while they're looking for you. That's true.
Get away.
Sure. It's useful to know where you should not be.
Explain, please.
If somebody's purpose and drive and need in life is to make themselves into something by diminishing others, then it's not a good place to be. If somebody wants to make you the object of their torment so that they can resolve for themselves the torment they're unwilling to face within themselves, it's a good time to get out.
Okay, so are you saying that as a metaphor of being judged by others, the cigar is a useful
What I'm saying is this, especially when you start to develop some skills, whatever those skills may be. If you have any attributes that others perceive as desirable, whether you're beautiful on the outside or beautiful on the inside, whether your ability to craft is beautiful, that aesthetic thing we talked about early on is innate to what it is to be human. Mm-hmm. We're pulled by it. Even when we try to avoid it, we're pulled by it. And the person who is beautiful in any way, and especially the person who's beautiful in multiple ways, and often that happens as a person realizes themselves internally, externally they become more attractive to others. There's something that emanates from them. That sense of congruency and internal resonance is beautiful in a way. And their actions and their acts become beautiful. Right? So now you have somebody who's attractive. And the people who are most needy, who have most bought into the persona that they've been given, that they recognize not being who they are, become vampirish and wanting to steal a bit from those beautiful people, if you will, the realization that they've achieved. They want to pull away from that, either to forgive themselves for not having the courage to do what's necessary, and therefore making it okay to continue doing what they're doing, even though they know at some profound level it's not right, or they want to, in some way, take from that person some of that essence, some of the elixir that they found, mm-hmm. so that hopefully they can cure their own wound. So it becomes salve for their soul, mm-hmm. that's deeply, deeply hurt.
How does smoke stand with vampires?
Well, again, when the person goes to grab, or the person goes to, grasp what's there, what they find is that all they have available to them is the trailing essence of what had been. So there's no one there to grab. There's nothing there to grab. But you leave enough of the essence in place, so to speak, so that they're fooled by it long enough so you don't have to deal with their intrusions.
Oh, okay. That's where the cigars come in. A trailing essence of what had been. A smoke screen. Right.
There's countless examples. A lot of the work, we're not necessarily going to go there right now, but a lot of the work I do is mythologically organized. So there's countless examples in the mythological lexicon of the individual who says something in the moment, who's got this kind of smoke-like quality that captures the offender's attention long enough for the person who said it to walk away, while the person is trying to unravel what's just been presented.
In other words, glitch.
Right. So sometimes it's useful to be able to occupy another's mind with something useful for them, actually. So you're actually, in a way, giving them a small gift so that it creates the opportunity and room for you to not have to be giving the gift away you're not ready to give that person because they demand it.
Mm. Incredible conversation. I'm just so honored to sit at the campfire of your hero's journey as it's unfolded so far. Mm-hmm. And I look forward to many more such conversations. But from this one, what can you tell people that might like to connect with you further? How can they receive of your skills and your smoke?
So if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to take another moment and put my own bow on the story, and then I'll give the answer to the question.
I prefer your bow any day.
So I was in a school doing a second doctorate, And in that doctorate, I had to do something called a viva, which is to present my work in a live interaction with somebody who was my mentor, who was going to review it and say whether or not it was up to par. And he made a comment to me. He said, I read your work and it was beguiling. It drew me in, and then I felt like there wasn't there what I needed to be because there was no one else present in the story. And I went, what are you talking about? He goes, well, you write about yourself and how you are like looking at the world, but you never tell us a story of what it's like to be you or to be in the world or bring anybody else in who has a perspective on you. And I, in that moment, had a small like flame of rage that kind of came up. And I said to him, then you didn't read the story. I said, how could you read my story? How could you sit here and hear the, autobiography of Joseph, so to speak, and not hear the story of my ancestors, my grandparents, my parents, my cousins, my uncles, my aunts, my friends, all the people I've come in contact with, including you, sitting here in front of me hearing the story. You've become part of the story. So anybody who tells their own story is never telling a story about themselves. They're telling a story about themselves in relation to the world. And if you don't have the ears to hear or the eyes to see the rest of the world showing up inside that individual story, then you're missing that the story that's being told is not the one that you're reading, not the one that you're hearing. So I'm going to say that although we spent some time here and we're at the kind of the campfire of Joseph, as you put it, to some extent, this isn't my story. Mm-hmm. It's the story that I've experienced alongside many, many other people, many of whom I think of as great and wonderful. And I'm humbled, again, to use that word, by the privilege of living a life where I get to interact with the people I've come across. Mm-hmm. And whether they were kind and generous or evil and corrupt, there's something in each of them that remains incredibly human. And that keeps rubbing against me in both the ways that I'm kind and generous and, evil and cruel, and allows me to be okay just being human. So if somebody were listening, that's the story I'd want them to hear. Mm-hmm. That all and everything is enough. Mm-hmm. There's no need to take away or to add in more than is present. But to be present to the reality of that there is everything that's there, and then to make choices about what you choose in any given moment to align with and move forward is what it is to become fully human. And someday we can explore that in the terms of Joseph Campbell's ideas and how that influenced my idea of this idea of becoming fully human.
Yes, please.
And if somebody did want to do that with me on a one-to-one basis, I recommend the place to always start is I flatter myself in thinking I'm a complex soul. So I would recommend before somebody reaches out and jumps into the deep water with me, they probably go to josephriggio.com, which is where my blog is. And my blog is really a series of articles. They tend to be long, a couple of pages, not a couple of paragraphs. And I get into ideas and I share resources and I point to other places, websites and authors and speakers that I think are interesting. And in doing that, I think that they would have a chance to get kind of a little more of what's behind the scenes and determine if what I have to offer is what they want. And if they did want to jump forward and go, listen, I'd love to have a conversation with you, there's an opportunity always to have a complimentary call with me. And that would be at a site which is https:// standard entry into a website. And it's vcita.com/Joseph Riggio. So
we'll
make it easier, but I want you to have a few hurdles.
Great. Yeah.
Right?
Oh, okay. You do. You want that.
Yeah. vcita.com/Joseph Riggio. And there's a place there to make a complimentary call. And when you come in, there's a few questions I ask. And one of the questions will be, are you prepared to take action if this is right for you, which will include spending a bit of money to take that action with me. And if you are, I'll probably respond to you positively and we'll set up a call. If you're not, I'll probably point you to some things I think might be useful depending on the rest of the information you share. And hopefully at some point, if it's good for us to get together, we'll meet.
Fantastic. So, and we will include those links in the show notes of this video for those that have picked up a whiff of your smoke and would like to immerse themselves in the cloud of it.
Very, very tobacco scented.
Thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure. I look forward to the next time.
All right. Ci vediamo. Okay.
Ci vediamo.
Ci vediamo. Purple kiss.
Perfect.